So at Apple's Let Loose event, Apple released two new iPads. They released their new iPad Air lineup, which has an M2 chip, as well as a new iPad Air size, with the 13-inch variant, which is basically just a recycled iPad Pro now at this point. And then they also released their M4 iPad Pro lineup, and this is the one that got the most amount of changes, with new visual design, some new hardware, the M4 chip, new OLED displays, the thinness with the 5.1mm thickness of the 13-inch iPad Pro, as well as the new Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil Pro. So there was a bunch that Apple released from a hardware perspective, and as an iPad first user and an iPad enthusiast that's been using, the iPad Pro lineup since around 2017, I have some thoughts about it. And also, Apple omitted a bunch of things that they changed about the iPad Pro that, again, they just didn't bring up in the keynote or in the Let Loose event. So in this video, let's talk about the iPad Pro, what it means, who I recommend it for, and then also what Apple didn't mention during this event. Let's get into it. So I'm going to be mostly focusing on the iPad Pro lineup because that's the one that got the most amount of differences, and that's the one that I personally ordered that's going to be my main iPad Pro moving forward when they do arrive on May 15th. But one of the main things that I want to talk about is that, yes, I do want to mention that they did revamp the hardware about it, and if you guys want to see an in-depth kind of recap of everything that they changed, I'll link our video recap down below. But of course, this iPad Pro is going to wow us with the thinness and probably the lightweight nature of it, and the OLED display is probably going to be amazing as well with how bright it is with 1000 nit standard brightness, and then that 1600 nit HDR peak brightness that we're going to get. So it's going to be extremely bright. It's going to feel probably for the most part like a new iPad, but after you kind of get used to the hardware changes and you start to get used to the new landscape camera and the thinness and probably the new fit and finish of the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil, at the end of the day, it's still going to be the same exact experience. So I'm going to be coming from an M1 iPad Pro running iPadOS 17.5, and I'm going to be running the same iPadOS software on the new iPad Pro when it does release on May 15th. And again, after you get used to those aesthetic changes and the hardware differences and probably the nice fact that it's going to be a more lightweight package overall, when I'm going to be doing the work that I'm doing on it, it's going to feel like an iPad Pro at the end of the day because it's going to feel like iPadOS. So basically what I want people to know and be aware of is that be a little bit wary about going full spec on the iPad Pro, and you know exactly who you are if you're going to be taking full advantage of the raw and sheer power that it has, because yes, with the M4 chip, it's going to be much more powerful than the M2 iPad Pro and more powerful than the M1 iPad Pro I'm coming from, so I might see some performance enhancements, being able to kind of export a video, but I can kind of see only one or two real use cases for me personally, where I'm going to see that new raw power be beneficial to my workflow. And that's going to be when editing videos in LumaFusion and then also editing thumbnails in Affinity Photo, because I will be seeing render speeds probably increase, exporting speeds probably increase, being able to have multiple layers is going to be a little bit better, but my M1 iPad Pro already kind of took care of all that, and it was already fast enough. It's just going to be faster now with the M4 iPad Pro. But then outside of that, the experience is going to be pretty much one-to-one. Like the fact that it's thinner, the fact that it has an OLED display isn't really going to change how I browse Safari, isn't really going to change how I watch YouTube videos, isn't really going to change how I'm messaging people on Slack. So overall, in my opinion, it's going to be a very similar experience. So you're going to have to ask yourself if that's going to be worth a $1,300 upgrade. And not only that, but now the new accessories that Apple has released alongside the M4 iPad Pro only work with the new M4 iPad Pro, meaning if you get an M4 iPad Pro and you're going to try to use your old Magic Keyboard and your old Apple Pencil 2, they are not compatible. And this goes into the perfect segue of talking about some of the things that Apple just didn't mention in their keynote or in the Let Loose event and kind of just washed over it. First of all, it's going to be compatibility across all accessories and all different devices. So with the new Magic Keyboard, that's only going to work with the brand new iPad Pro. It does not work with old iPad Pros, and then vice versa. So the M4 iPad Pro will not work with the old Magic Keyboard. And then another thing is that Apple isn't taking trade-in value for the Magic Keyboard or the Apple Pencil. So if you do trade in your old iPad Pro for the new iPad Pro, you're kind of stuck with these old accessories that were once worth $350 and $130 respectively. And now with the Apple Pencil Pro, I am a big fan of it because it does bring some actual tangible features that are very different, and I can see people taking more advantage of that Apple Pencil 2 with the gyroscope and the rotation calculations, as well as being able to squeeze to pull up the little toolbox, and then also the Find My support, all welcome upgrades to a brand new Apple Pencil. The form factor is exactly the same, it charges the exact same way, but again, that Apple Pencil Pro only is going to work with the M4 iPad Pro and the M2 iPad Air. If you want to get just the Apple Pencil Pro and want to take advantage of some of those features and you have an M2 iPad Pro that you just recently purchased, unfortunately you will not be able to take advantage of that Apple Pencil Pro because of the fact that it's only made for the newer iPads. So if you do want to get a brand new iPad Pro and you use it like a laptop with an older iPad Pro like you do with the Magic Keyboard, you're going to have to shell out $1,300 for the new 13-inch iPad Pro, but then also $350 for the Magic Keyboard and another $130 for the Apple Pencil Pro. Pro. So again, this package becomes a little bit more intense and becomes a little bit more cost prohibitive because of the fact that you have to also spend almost $500 on accessories to get the full experience. And then another thing that Apple didn't mention is actually on the rear of the iPad, and it has to do with the camera sensors. First and foremost, from a design standpoint, it looks like it's one full unibody design. We've gotten used to kind of having the metal backing of the iPad Pro, but then having kind of like a glass square for the actual camera sensors, but this looks like it's just one big unibody design. There's no more glass involved, it's all aluminum around there, which again is a nice little design standpoint. But if you really kind of look at it, Apple removed the ultra-wide camera from the iPad Pro. Now, I'm not a big user of the iPad Pro when it comes to taking pictures and photos and things like that, but it's weird that Apple just removed it without saying anything or telling anybody. The only thing that they really mentioned about the rear camera, that it's going to be even better for scanning documents and things like that, which is really the only use case that I personally have for the rear camera sensors, so it's not a huge deal that they removed it. It was just interesting that they completely removed it without saying anything. And then, obviously, you still have your LiDAR scanner on the back for any augmented reality use cases, and then Apple did kind of fix up and touch up the actual two-tone flash to make it a little bit better for those document scanning use cases. And then when it comes to the M4 chip internally, yes, Apple gave us, the graphs that kind of compare to older models, and then the 38 trillion kind of actions that are happening with the transistors, and they throw out a lot of numbers at you to give you kind of this wow factor. But to kind of break it down in terms of what you're getting with the M4 chip, you actually have two different versions of the M4 chip for the iPad Pro that you can get, and unfortunately Apple didn't let us spec it out kind of how you would with a Mac or with a MacBook Pro or something like that. You basically have two different options. You can go from the 128 gigs to the 512 gigs of internal storage, which gives you the 9-core CPU and 10-core GPU version with only 8 gigs of RAM. And then if you go with the 1TB or 2TB version, you do get up to 16 gigs of RAM, and then you also get an additional CPU core, so it gives you 10 CPU cores and 10 GPU cores, which ideally should give you some more real-world use cases in terms of getting a little bit more done. It's not the end of the world, but the more important fact is the fact that you can only get 8 gigs of RAM with the 512 gig version, and then you need to get the 1TB version to go and get 16 gigs of RAM, which is one that I personally opted to go for. But again, I've been using the M1 iPad Pro for almost 3 years now, and it's a baseline model with 128 gigs of storage, and it still only has 8 gigs of RAM, and for the most part, it's been working wonderfully. And then another spec that Apple added is the ability to get a matte finish display, very similar to the Pro Display XDR, and for an additional $100 you can pick it up, but something that Apple didn't mention is that you do need to get a 1TB iPad Pro. So the cheapest way to get the nano texture display on the iPad Pro, it's going to cost you $2,000 in order to get that, because it's going to cost you $18.99 to get the 1TB version, and then you have to spend an additional $100 for $19.99 in order to get the actual nano texture display. So Apple's not letting just anybody get that nano texture display on the lower end. They kind of make it seem like you need to be on the higher end because they don't want anybody to just walk in and pick up this display not knowing exactly what they're getting themselves into. But one thing that I do want to bring up is because of the fact that the iPad Pro is now much thinner and the chassis is smaller, meaning there's less open air inside of the iPad Pro, that could mean that the actual iPad Pro speakers could take a hit. iPad Pros have been known for having amazing speaker quality from both a loudness standpoint, but also a quality standpoint, and it's also extremely bassy because there was enough room for air to kind of get moved around in there and give you enough of a space to actually get an extra bass in there and some thud when it comes to the speakers. Now, I'm somebody that does listen to their iPad Pro speakers out loud because they are just that good, but now the fact that it is a lot thinner, it's more compact, there's less space in there, I do believe that the speakers will still be just as loud, but the bass is going to be a lot less, making it a little bit more tinny, which is going to be, a little bit more inconvenient because Apple just didn't even bring up the speakers this time around for the most part, so I'm curious to know what you guys think when it comes to that speaker array. And then lastly, I do want to bring up that Magic Keyboard and then also charging. With the M1 and M2 iPad Pros, the most that you can actually charge your iPad Pro is at 33 watts, and that's when you're directly plugged into it. And then when you were using the Magic Keyboard of old, when you plugged it into the actual little hinge that was on there for power pass-through, you would charge up to, I believe, 22 watts of speed, which is not fast charging, but just fast enough to still kind of keep everything rolling if you are doing something on the iPad Pro. Now, with the new Magic Keyboard, technically the power pass-through is going to allow up to 60 watts of power pass-through. They didn't really come out and say specifically that the iPad Pro now supported 60 watt charging when you plug directly in, but they kind of insinuated by saying that the Magic Keyboard supported 60 watts of power pass-through. So we're still dealing with the 3 pin connectors on the rear, there is no data pass-through, which Apple didn't give us, so those are all things to consider when it comes to the actual charging capabilities, and Apple also didn't increase the size of the battery, which they could have instead of making it thinner. So Apple is touting the same battery life of the older iPad Pro, which is honestly was not the best, especially when you're doing things like editing 4K video and having multiple layers. At that point, my iPad battery was only lasting about 4 hours on a full charge. So let's see exactly what this new thinner iPad can do from a charging standpoint, but also from a heat management standpoint. Very curious to see what that actual thinness is going to do to the iPad Pro. So again, all this is to say that honestly, I would recommend you wait until WWDC. iPadOS 18 should be a make or break moment for the iPad to kind of let us know exactly where Apple wants to take this iPadOS situation. Do they want the iPad Pro to be kind of like a Surface competitor where you are running kind of this pro level application that you can kind of get most of your work done? Or is this going to be for an entry-level user that kind of has some niche workflows that are pretty intensive that require a good amount of power, but where for the most part it's going to be kind of just used for Slack and for iMessage and for Safari and things like that in just a very slim and portable form factor? I like to think that depending on what use case you're using it in or what workflow you kind of use it in, you can find a way to get from point A to point B in any situation, including in the iPad Pro. It's just kind of, there is a little bit of a learning curve with iPadOS. But that's what I'm curious to see what Apple does with iPadOS 18 and if they kind of really close the gap between macOS and iPadOS. And I know we've been saying this pretty much since iPadOS 13 when it first separated between iOS and iPadOS, but I do think that now that we have the hardware in place, the form factor is in place, the new Magic Keyboard makes it feel like you're using a MacBook Pro now apparently. This is all kind of putting together to really give us a good version of iPadOS 18 that a lot of people will be happier about. Now, I don't think it's going to be a one-to-one to macOS. It's still going to have its own quirks and things like that. So to each their own to figure out exactly if iPadOS 18 is going to be for you for your workflow. But let me know in the comment down below what you think. Apple, in my opinion, yes, they updated it from a hardware standpoint and it looks absolutely amazing and it looks magical having such a thin pane of glass and metal and there's a full computer in there. But at the end of the day, the experience, once you sit down at your desk and you're using it kind of like in a laptop form factor, it's going to be the same thing in my opinion. So let me know in the comment down below what you think. Are you excited for the iPad Pros? Did you pick one up? Are you maybe looking at maybe the refurbished market for the used iPad Pros to get a better price point? Because that is going to be an awesome situation as well. Kind of getting secondary used iPad Pros with M1 and M2 versions, which are still extremely capable in their own right. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys made it to the end, leave a little dolphin in the comments down below so I know you made it to the end. And again, let me know what you guys thought of the Let Loose event, where you think Apple's going to be taking the iPad Pro moving forward, because I'm very curious to know. But if you guys want to watch more videos like this one, click on one of these videos right here. And until next time, I'm Fernando, and I'm out of here, everybody. Peace. I'm still very excited for the iPad Pro. I just want everybody to understand what they're getting themselves into.